All right, everybody, welcome to another deep dive. This one, it's a wild one. We're talking about Vlad the Impaler. You might know him as Vlad Dracula.
Yeah. Yeah.
That Dracula. Now, he's remembered as this bloodthirsty tyrant, but also as a national hero in Romania. So was he pure evil, or was he a brilliant strategist? Or maybe just a product of a really messed up time?
You know what's so interesting about Vlad is he really embodies that paradox perfectly. He inspires both fear and admiration. And trying to separate fact from fiction is a real challenge when it comes to him. To understand him, we need to go way beyond the vampire stories and really delve into the historical context of 15th century Wallachia.
Let's do it. I've got a stack of books and articles here, and honestly, some of this stuff is pretty disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get to all the gruesome details, let's start with the name Dracula. I mean, it's pretty hard to separate that from, well, vampires.
Yeah, it's definitely a name that carries a lot of baggage. But that connection to vampires that came much later with Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula actually means son of the dragon. And it's a reference to Vlad's father, Vlad II, who was a member of the Order of the Dragon.
Hold on, wait a minute. A dragon-slaying order is the origin story for, like, the world's most famous vampire? That's kind of hilarious.
It really is. It's one of those historical quirks that makes you realize how intertwined symbols and meanings can become over time. The Order of the Dragon was this chivalric order, and they were dedicated to defending Christendom from the Ottoman Turks. So it's really kind of fascinating how this symbol of protection against like a perceived evil eventually morphs into something so much darker.
Okay, so that's wild. So tell me about Vlad's childhood. Was he always a little off?
Well, imagine growing up in 15th century Wallachia, this landlocked region in what is now Romania. It was constantly caught between this expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. Not exactly a peaceful place to grow up. Vlad was actually born in Siezora, Transylvania, a region just steeped in history and legend.
Transylvania. Talk about setting the stage for a spooky story.
Right. And get this, Vlad's childhood home overlooked a square where public executions took place, often by hanging, so it's not hard to imagine young Vlad witnessing all these gruesome spectacles. Might have had some impact on him. What do you think?
Yeah, that's not your average childhood playground. It makes you wonder if that constant exposure to violence kind of desensitized him. But his story gets even crazier. He was sent to the Ottoman court as a hostage, right?
He was. Vlad and his younger brother Radu, they were sent by their father to the Ottoman court as a guarantee of loyalty to the Sultan. Imagine being a teenager, ripped away from your home, forced to live among your potential enemies. It must have been such a formative and likely traumatic experience.
Oh, I can only imagine the tension and the fear.
Oof.
Did this experience kind of plant the seeds for his later ruthlessness? Did he learn from the Ottomans? Maybe adopt some of their tactics?
That's a really good question, and it's one that historians continue to debate to this day. Some argue that that period of captivity really exposed him to the intricacies of Ottoman politics and their military strategy, and that this experience really shaped his understanding of power and control. And, it's certainly plausible that he learned a thing or two about wielding fear as a weapon. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024, 1231, part 2 of 3. It's interesting to think about how different personalities would respond to that kind of trauma. Vlad seems to have just hardened. He becomes cynical and maybe even more ambitious.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't content to just sit back and play nice when he got back to Wallachia. He jumped right into a power struggle.
Absolutely. Wallachia at that time was like a political pressure cooker. You had the Ottomans constantly pushing for expansion. You had the Hungarians vying for influence. And then, of course, all the internal factions within Wallachia itself, all fighting for control.
So not exactly a relaxing retirement plan for Vlad II.
Yeah.
So what was Vlad's strategy? Did he just rely on brute force, or was there more to his game?
Well, he definitely wasn't afraid to use violence, and impalement became like his signature method of punishment. But, to reduce him to just a bloodthirsty tyrant, I think that's really an oversimplification. He was actually a very skilled diplomat and a pretty shrewd strategist. He knew how to play different factions against each other.
Okay, so he wasn't just a brute. He had some political savvy, too. Give me an example. How did his diplomacy play out in this mess of competing interests?
Okay, well, a great example is his relationship with the Saxons. Now, the Saxons were this powerful merchant class, mostly German-speaking. They had settled in Transylvania, and they had their own economic interests, and they were often allied with Hungary. Vlad saw them as a threat, both economically and politically.
So he had the Ottomans to the south, the Hungarians and their Saxon allies to the north, and who knows what kind of scheming was going on within Wallachia itself.
Yeah.
So what did he do about the Saxons? Did he just go full impaler on them?
He definitely used force at times, but there was also a strategic element to his actions. He really wanted to break their economic power and undermine their allegiance to Hungary. There were periods of negotiation and even cooperation, but that relationship was always just fraught with tension.
Got it. So it was a delicate dance between brute force and strategic maneuvering. But let's be honest here, Vlad is most notorious for his use of impalement. So what was it about this particularly gruesome method that made it so effective?
Well, impalement wasn't just about killing your enemies. It was about sending a message, the sheer brutality of it, the way that victims were left to die slowly and agonizingly. It was meant to instill terror. It was psychological warfare at its most extreme.
And it clearly worked. I mean, the guy's nickname is the Impaler. But was this level of brutality really necessary? Were there any other options available to him?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some historians argue that, in the context of 15th century warfare, Vlad's methods weren't actually that unusual. Cruelty was unfortunately a common tactic used by many rulers at the time.
So you're saying that in a world where everyone was playing dirty sake, Vlad just happened to be the best at it?
In a way, yes, but the scale and the spectacle of his impalements, that did seem to set him apart. And the psychological impact was undeniable. It demoralized his enemies, it deterred rebellions. And it really solidified his control over Wallachia.
It sounds incredibly effective, but also incredibly disturbing. It's hard to wrap your head around that level of brutality.
It is. And I think that's why Vlad's story continues to fascinate us. It forces us to confront that darker side of human nature and to grapple with these uncomfortable questions about power and violence and the lengths to which people will go to achieve their goals.
It definitely makes you think. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about Vlad's brutality, but he's also celebrated as a national hero in Romania. How do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory views?
It's really a testament to the complexity of his legacy. For many Romanians, Vlad is a symbol of resistance against the Ottomans, a defender of their homeland who stood strong when others faltered. They admire his strength, his determination, his willingness to fight for his people.
So they focus on the defender aspect and they kind of downplay the brutality?
Not necessarily downplay, but they view it through a different lens. They argue that in a world of constant warfare, Vlad was simply doing what he had to do to protect his people. His ruthlessness, they say, was a necessary evil in the face of even greater threats.
It's a fascinating perspective. It makes you wonder how our perception of these historical figures is shaped by our own cultural and historical context. But what about the Dracula connection? How did a 15th century Wallachian prince become the inspiration for one of literature's most famous vampires?
That is a story for the ages, and it has more to do with myth-making and literary license than historical accuracy. Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, he drew inspiration from various sources, folklore and historical accounts of Vlad the Impaler, but he also took a lot of creative liberties.
So Vlad wasn't actually a vampire. No late-night blood drives or aversion to sunlight.
Not that we know of. The vampire connection really took hold after Stoker's novel was published in 1897. It just captured the public imagination. And Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure, became intertwined with Dracula, the fictional monster.
It's amazing how fiction can sometimes overshadow reality.
Yeah.
But speaking of reality, let's get back to Vlad's story. He had a pretty tumultuous relationship with the Ottoman Empire, didn't he? Wasn't he constantly at war with them?
He was. His entire reign was marked by this struggle against Ottoman expansion. He led numerous campaigns against them, some successful, some not. But there's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked.
Ooh, I love a good plot twist. What's the overlooked part?
Well, remember, Vlad spent years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, along with his brother Radu. Well, Radu had a very different experience than Vlad. He assimilated into Ottoman culture, converted to Islam, and even rose to a position of power within the Ottoman military.
Wait, are you serious? So while Vlad is fighting tooth and nail against the Ottomans, his own brother is fighting for them?
That's right. Radu, known as Radu the Handsome, eventually challenged Vlad for the Wallachian throne, with the backing of the Ottomans.
Wow, talk about family drama. This is getting better than any soap opera. So it wasn't just a clash of empires, it was a clash of brothers, a clash of ideologies, a clash of destinies.
It really highlights the complex dynamics at play in this period, Personal ambition, religious differences, political maneuvering, it all gets tangled up in this epic struggle for power.
And where does Vlad's infamous night attack fit into all of this? That's the event that really solidified his reputation for brutality.
Ah, yes. The night attack of 1462 is one of the most dramatic episodes in Vlad's story. He led this daring night raid on the Ottoman camp, impaling thousands of soldiers and sending shockwaves through the Sultan's forces.
It's one thing to hear about impalement, But to imagine the sheer scale of this attack,
Yeah.
thousands of impaled bodies, it's hard to fathom.
It was a bold and brutal move. Some historians argue that it was a brilliant tactical maneuver, that bought Vlad valuable time and resources. Others see it as an act of desperation, a sign that he was losing his grip on power.
But it definitely cemented his image as this ruthless and terrifying enemy, and probably gave the Sultan some pretty vivid nightmares.
Likely. The night attack became a legend, a tale whispered in hushed tones throughout the Ottoman Empire, and it just added another layer to Vlad's already complex legacy.
We've covered a lot of ground here. From Vlad's brutal methods to his political maneuvering and his complicated relationship with the Ottoman Empire, it's clear that he was more than just a bloodthirsty tyrant.
He was a complex figure, shaped by a turbulent time and driven by this mix of ambition and pragmatism, and this fierce determination to protect his homeland.
Well, I think we've successfully separated the man from the myth, or at least we've tried.
In doing so, we've uncovered a story that's far more interesting than any vampire tale. It's a story of power, betrayal, resilience, and the enduring human capacity for both great cruelty and remarkable courage.
That's a great way to put it. We'll be right back with the final part of our deep dive on Vlad the Impaler. Stay tuned. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2024-1231, part 3 of 3. Welcome back to the deep dive, you guys. So we've been unpacking this enigma that is Vlad the Impaler, and let me tell you, this guy's story just keeps getting more intriguing.
I know, it really does. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, only instead of tears, you just get this potent mix of horror and fascination.
Exactly. We've talked about his brutality, his political cunning, even his own brother's shocking betrayal. But before we wrap up this deep dive, we have to talk about the legacy that Vlad left behind. I mean, the guy inspired Dracula. How wild is that?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. It's a testament to the power of storytelling. And maybe, our own kind of morbid fascination with the dark side of human nature. Vlad's story, even before Bram Stoker, got his hands on it, it was already this blend of fact and fiction and exaggeration.
Right, and Stoker took all those fragments and he wove them into this Gothic masterpiece that has captivated readers for over a century. But that Dracula connection has also had a real-world impact, hasn't it? I mean, Transylvania is practically synonymous with vampires now.
It's true. You can't walk through a souvenir shop in Transylvania without being bombarded with images of bats and coffins and fangs. And let's not forget the whole vampire tourism industry that's sprung up around Bran Castle.
Bran Castle, the iconic Dracula's castle. But wait a minute, didn't our research say that Vlad probably never even set foot in that castle?
That's right. It's more of a marketing ploy than historical accuracy. I mean, Bran Castle is a beautiful and imposing structure, but its connection to Vlad is pretty tenuous. The real contender for Dracula's castle is actually Poenari Castle.
Poenari Castle. Now, that's a name that sounds appropriately ominous, so tell me more about this real Dracula's castle.
Well, imagine a crumbling fortress perched high on a cliff top, overlooking this winding river. It's more rugged and less glamorous than Bran Castle, but it has this raw, almost primal energy that's hard to describe. And unlike Bran, we know for a fact that Vlad used Poenari as a stronghold.
Okay, now that's a setting fit for a vampire novel.
Yeah.
It's like you can almost feel Vlad's presence there, surveying his domain, plotting his next move.
Yeah, but it's easy to kind of romanticize these historical figures. And we have to remember that Vlad's reign was marked by, brutal violence and political maneuvering. He was a product of his time. But even by 15th century standards, his methods were extreme.
That's the thing about Vlad, isn't it? He just defies easy categorization. He was a brilliant military strategist, a ruthless tyrant, a defender of his people, and inadvertently the inspiration for this huge cultural phenomenon. It's mind-boggling.
It really is. And, his story continues to raise all these important questions about power and ambition and the human capacity for both good and evil.
So at the end of this deep dive, do we have a definitive answer to the question, hero or villain?
I don't think there is a simple answer. History is rarely black and white. Vlad was this complex figure who left behind a very complicated legacy. He was a product of his time, but he also kind of transcended it, and he's become this symbol that resonates across centuries and cultures.
Well said. I think what's most important is that we've shed some light on the man behind the myth, the historical figure who was kind of obscured by the shadow of Dracula.
Exactly. And in doing so, we've learned a thing or two about the complexities of history, the blurred lines between good and evil, and the enduring power of storytelling.
Absolutely. Big thanks to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive. And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. Until next time.